Everyone. It's very nice to see everyone this evening. Particularly nice to see everyone this evening, and especially nice to see an open physical zendo, albeit in a little rectangle. And I feel somewhat distant. It's still really comforting to know that we're practicing together in a physical community as well, and that these two things are coming together in such a sort of seamless way so far. So I'm excited by this. And there's, my name is Jo An, if I didn't say that out loud, and there are a few faces here I am not super familiar with, so nice to see new faces. And I'm speaking to you from New Paltz, New York, where I live. And I'm struck today by the amount of rain we've had and how the earth just seems so very receptive. And it feels like a good day for the earth to feel receptive, a good day to plant seeds. And I know today some people have done that, and it just feels right somehow today. So recently I had dinner with some Sangha members many of you may know, Keishin and Jiryu and Manchin, after a Monday night period of zazen here and virtually as well. And we got together and had some food, and we were just talking that sort of, what's going on in your life, what's happening. And I shared that I felt just exhausted, and psychically and spiritually and mentally and physically just wiped out, completely and utterly drained. And a while back, I had given a talk on the misuse of the term burnout and how I found it, sort of reprehensible to use that word, that we should call it moral distress, because that's what it is. As a nurse, we know what to do, but the system is against us, and, that's what causes this moral distress. It's not burnout, but I feel burned out. The truth of the matter is, at that moment, and it continues, that I feel just cooked, really cooked by the events in the world that just seem to be incessant and incredibly painful to bear witness to. And for some reason, which seems deeply ingrained in me, I feel like I'm supposed to feel differently than I feel. And it's like, what is that? And I thought, oh, that's our first noble truth. That is dukkha. That is that suffering that comes up so easily when we experience unrest. The original translation of the Sanskrit, I think others have talked about this, is something about how the axle meets the wheel. There's a bump in the ride. So, what is this bump in the ride? And, sometimes when there's one horrific event after another, that ride can just start to feel like only bump and no ride. So perhaps we came to practice to get rid of the bump. That might have been what brought us to practice, and that's not a bad pursuit entirely. But, as I was saying, when the ride feels just like one bump after another, for myself, if I'm brutally honest, I feel like I lose control of the wheel, that my alignment gets thrown off because there's so many bumps in the road that I can't stay on the road, and I find myself off the road, if that makes sense, and if I'm supposed to stick with this metaphor now that I've started it. But as Zen practitioners, we're tasked with staying awake, with waking up, with staying awake, with paying attention to the events that are unfolding in front of us, moment after moment. And in the world today, I sometimes think maybe that's extra hard, with social media and multi-channels, going in all directions, feeding us information that, shows us how horribly we are suffering, and in really graphic detail much of the time. And I think that volume, the sheer, succession, has an impact on, at least on my mental state, and my limbic system feels, really worked on. And as a nurse, I think I can speak for the profession a bit and say, yeah, we are tired. We're tired as a profession these past couple of years. And now, what seems like horrible event on the heels of horrible event is exhausting. So I think I'm going to have a visitor in a second. He's telling me, just shake it off, bud. But our practice doesn't, offer us really any salve to protect us from this. What our practice does offer us is things as they actually are, and clarity to see things and experience things as they actually are. So I've shared before, here where I am, the property I'm on, and the property the Zendo is on, just up the driveway away. In the summers feels a little bit like an oasis, a bit of an island. There's growth on, the borders of the property, and I can have this idea that I'm alone in my little island of overgrowth. But then in the spring, like now, as things are still filling in, and in the fall when things sort of fall away and open up a bit, I get to recognize, nope, my neighbors are actually just there. What I thought was distance, and at a distance is actually very, very, very close. And in fact, the barrier is just a fairly rotted out, dilapidated, falling apart, wire mesh fence. You're fine, miss. Please have a seat and relax. So in an effort to be good neighbors this winter, after we had strong ice storms that brought down a lot of limbs on pines on one section of our driveway, we decided the time has come to clean these up. We need to get in there the big branches, big wide branches that had fallen down that we had yet gotten to. This was the weekend. It was a long weekend. We don't celebrate any holiday here, so we said, let's do it. So out came the chainsaw, and, it wasn't just as easy as, finding the wood that was salvageable for firewood and cutting away the smaller branches. These, trees underneath have a network of Virginia creeper and poison ivy and other smaller trees that have grown up into the branches and worked their way into them. So there was a lot of, what gets pulled, what doesn't get pulled. So these vines that entangled, sometimes it was a matter of grabbing it and pulling it out by the roots and feeling a great success. Sometimes it was, let's cut it at the root and leave it until it wilts more and we can pull it out. Other times we had to recognize, oh, this vine is actually supporting a major limb in this tree. The two are inseparable at this juncture, and so this has to stay. So it took a lot of discrimination. And, I had to look and say, so what stays, what goes, and who decides? Who makes the decision about what stays and what goes? And who makes the decision about what is of value and what is seen as strangling something else of its value, that is of more value, so then it has to go. And really, all through the lens of, most importantly, what will the neighbors think? Which, I jokingly say in the metaphor, but at the same time, isn't that part of it as well? How will I be perceived? So Dogen in his fascicle, Kato, Twining Vines, shares what appears in many other places as a koan referencing the transmission of to Hueki from Bodhidharma, the first ancestor from India into China, to the first Chinese ancestor. But here he shares the story in maybe a broader sense, in a wider sense, Dogen does. And he shares, the basics of this, and many of you have heard it before, is, he sort of asks his group of students, tell me about your understanding. And one by one, they share their understanding. And the first who shares a wonderful understanding of the Dharma. And Bodhidharma says, you have my skin. And the second shares another understanding of the Dharma. And he says, well, you have my flesh, and so on, down to bones, until finally it gets to Hueki. And Hueki bows 3 times and then just returns to where he was standing. And Bodhidharma says, you have my marrow. And so this is the transmission story, in essence, of Bodhidharma to Hueki. And we might look at it on first glance as gradated, right? that, oh, well, the skin's sort of on the outside and the flesh is there, and then there's the bone, and then there's the marrow. That's where the transition is. And that's a true story. That's true. That has truth to it. But Dogen in this fascicle shares this, and it spoke to me. To attain the skin is to attain bones, flesh, and marrow. To attain bones, flesh, and marrow is to attain skin, flesh, and face. It is to understand that not only that all the worlds of the 10 directions are the true body, but that they are skin, flesh, and bones, and marrow. In this way you attain my robe. You attain the Dharma. Our being awake, our enlightenment, maybe even we could call it our transmission, our moment-to-moment transmission. It's certainly not always, the twirling flower of Buddha and Mahakashyapa, is it? It's not always, some lovely story of, oh, I recognize, the universality of all phenomena in the twirling of a flower, and now I possess the marrow, the red blood cell making tissues of the Dharma. It's not always that. It would be nice if it was, but sometimes I think it's a bit more, as Enkyo Roshi shared in her Dharma talk at the eye-opening, of Huineng, our sixth ancestor, running for his life. Running for his life. It makes me think of hiding in subway stations and basements, looking for an exit from your own country and not being able to find it. Sometimes it's like that, and it's not the twirling of a flower. And you think, Wei Nang stopped and put his robe down on the rock. He stopped and put it down. Bodhidharma gave his skin, his flesh, his bones, his marrow. He said, you possess it. It's yours. And I think they could do that because they recognize the robe of liberation is not given and it's not taken. There's no transmission outside of this moment. There's nothing outside of this moment. And so they could lay the robe down freely because they recognized it's vast. It doesn't fit in a rock suitcase. There's no piece of luggage big enough or fancy enough to contain it. The robe of liberation is vast. We chant it every morning. So when I was working on the edge of the yard underneath the pines, I had to determine what was of value and what needed to be removed. And that luxury of the oneness of skin and marrow being equal, it doesn't serve you in a lot of situations. In nursing and medicine, it certainly doesn't serve you. You have to decide what is illness, what is health, and make decisions based on that. And in gardening and landscaping, it's much the same. For the pine to survive, the vines that were choking it out needed to be removed. So that's what our practice, I think, is about a bit, bearing witness, seeing what may need to be removed altogether, what needs to be cut back, what needs to be pulled up and planted elsewhere, and paying attention to what requires nourishment and watering. So we have this brand new chainsaw, and it's so fun and exhilarating and exciting. And I feel really butch when I have it in my hands, like I'm like, a lumberjack. And so it works for me on so many levels. But the exhilaration of cutting through, all kidding aside, that tool also needs to be, sort of coupled with standing back and saying, oh, no, wait, that actually supports me. So I've often thought of my sensitivity, sort of my hypervigilance because of past traumas, as something that needs to be cut away. It's a bump in my ride. It doesn't make it smooth. But now, after a little bit in the pine trees with my chainsaw, I kind of see what I thought was a barrier can be a support. And what was a bump in the ride is now, in some ways, just the ride. So is it that I've got used to the bump, or what is it? And I think what it may be is that as I cleared away what needed to be cleared away and recognized what needed to stay, I appreciated that my exhaustion, my feeling overwhelmed, was not so much the events of the world as it was the story I was telling myself about the events of the world. I'm not less exhausted. The events of the world are still exhausting, but I don't have to have a story about it per se. So, and I don't feel so separated when I am in that state. And I can recognize a bit that enlightenment is not some other place, and the bump hasn't knocked me off the road, so to speak. The suffering hasn't ended. All the horrors that can be committed are still being committed as we speak, and they likely always have been, I suppose. But I think what Dogen is saying in Kato, in Twining Vines, is that the transmission from Shakyamuni Buddha to Mahakashyapa is available to all of us, moment mind after moment mind after moment mind, regardless of what it looks like, if we're willing to receive it. So, and not see it as something to hope for, to something that's in the future that I can hope for. And, I was listening to Yuka's talk recently at one of her last ones, and in it she said, what did she say? I'm not a fan of hope. It spoils the appetite for life. And I think maybe what she was saying there is, it's not in the future. It's not somewhere else. Don't miss it. It's right here. It's right here. And those two vines, that what supports what? The classic part of the story is this is a transmission story, that there's no separation between the transmission of Bodhidharma and of Huiki, that they were transmitting at the same time, like two vines entwined. And, but I think that that's where we get the problem. We see them as separate. We see the two as separate. And I know Yuka didn't see that. Yuka didn't see that separation. So I'm going to leave you with a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, a bit for Yuka and a bit to sort of cap this talk. It is entitled Contemplation on No Coming and No Going. This body is not me. I am not limited by this body. I am life without boundaries. I have never been born, and I have never died. Look at the ocean and the sky filled with stars, manifestations from my wondrous true mind. Since before time, I have been free. Birth and death are only doors through which we pass, sacred thresholds on our journey. Birth and death are a game of hide and seek, so laugh with me, hold my hand. Let us say goodbye to meet again soon. We meet today, we will meet again tomorrow, we will meet at the source every moment. We meet each other in all forms of life.